All right, so we're going to get started here with the Oregon Promise Bootcamp. Thank you for joining me. The agenda for today is to review the requirements of Oregon Promise so that you understand what those are for purposes of helping students in any capacity that you work with them. We'll talk about the first year experience requirement in detail. We'll also go over other Oregon Promise review, requirements and a review of the program. We will go over the Oregon Promise coverage and how exactly that plays out with different types of students. Go over some detail about applying to Oregon Promise. I've had several conversations with advisors running into students who are in the process of applying, and sometimes they're not sure how to best advise students, so we'll go over that. Also, some specific information about Oregon Promise that we provide through the PCC website, and then I will also open it up for questions. I will actually allow questions as we go along, so I will notify you when there are opportunities to ask questions, and then you'll have a chance to chime in. Okay, so I see Amy joined me. I'm hosting a webinar. Amy inspired me to do this. Amy is our OSAC HEC guru, and I see that she is here with us today. So I'm going to be playing webinar host with a lot of the information that Amy has provided for me in the past. So anyway, I wanted to go over here and get started with my contact info in case nobody has my contact information and you want to record it. I will also be sharing this at the end of the presentation. So there's my phone number, my email, and the webpage that I maintain here at PCC with information about Oregon Promise. So let's talk about the first year experience requirement first and foremost and what those pieces cover here at PCC. So one of the things that we require of students is to attend a welcome day, and we kind of bundle this as part of our first year experience program. And the whole idea behind the first year experience is it's a program to help students get integrated, get acclimated to the culture of college. And so we hold these summer welcome days for students. And so since the majority of our Oregon Promise students come in that fall incoming class, the recent spring graduates coming in the fall, we reach out to them and tell them that they are required to attend a welcome day. Now, for the winter and spring starting students, we're not as strict with this requirement simply because we do not have that many students coming at that time. So we do refer them to information similar to what we have in the welcome day through the website. But for that large group of students that comes in the fall, we require that they attend a welcome day. We know that there are students who, even with the announcement that it's required, and even with the options that we offer them through the summer, that it might not work for them. So usually I tell anybody who's working with students to refer the students to me, and I will work with them directly to make sure that they get the welcome day related information and take steps that will basically cover what they would have received through the welcome day experience. And then for those of you who have participated in a PCC welcome day, you know that during welcome day, we have every student meet with an academic advisor. And so reviewing courses with the advisor and getting ready for registration is one of the key things we want to make sure students get out of that. So in the event that a student is not able to make it to a welcome day, then I will work with that student to make sure that they get together with an advisor so that they can be ready for registering for classes. But that's another component that we incorporate into that summer requirement. Then comes kind of more the requirements of things that students will do during their first year at PCC. And here at PCC, we have devised a system that after a couple of years, I think we finally found the right balance. And that is that students during their first year at PCC are required to either complete the 3-credit CG 100 College Survival and Success class, or they can complete an online program called Panther Tracks for Oregon Promise. And I'm going to go into some detail about both of these right now. So the CG 100 course is our most recommended approach to meeting the first year experience program. And that is because we have data that shows that students who participate in classes like CG 100 tend to be more successful, especially if they take this class early on in their academic career. So what we are hoping to do with this class is to capture as many students as possible who can take this course, to take advantage of doing this during their first term. It really kind of serves as an orientation, an extended orientation to their first year at PCC. So it is a 3-credit class. It can be taken any term within that first year at PCC. And it covers things like academic resources, time management, self-care, stress management, financial planning, etc. And so this is what we highly recommend to students. And when we present to students this information, we stress that this is the preferred option in order to meet the first year experience requirement. However, after our first year, we ran into some issues in that there are students who are at PCC, especially students in career technical programs, who have a pretty heavy load of credits, even starting off their first term at PCC. And so getting started that first term might lead to those students to taking on an extra 3 credits might be too much of a burden on top of everything else that they have to do for their program. So taking that into account, we developed the non-credit free option of Panther Tracks for Oregon Promise. So it covers a lot of similar information. We actually have drawn for Panther Tracks a lot of the content that is in CG 100, but it's not as comprehensive. Panther Tracks already existed prior to being made a part of Oregon Promise. It was an open web page that students could go and access. But what we do here with this version is that we've kind of tweaked it a little bit for Oregon Promise students, and it also tracks students' progress through Panther Tracks. So that way I can see if students have satisfied and completed all the modules in it. And like I said, it's better suited for those students for whom having a heavy class load, or for whatever other reason, maybe they've already taken a CG class through a dual credit partnership or something like that. So this serves more as a refresher for those students. And I have found that having it's interesting, we did some training with an organization recently, and they were talking about behavioral economics and how when you mandate something, you tend to have less buy-in into it than when you give people an option. So before we were mandating strictly the CG 100, and we were getting a lot of flack for it, a lot of students protesting that why are we requiring them to do this class, etc. Now that we give them the choice, we're actually getting more participation in CG 100 because students are kind of weighing the benefits of both, and they're jumping in to the opportunity to take the class if it's not something that we are forcing them to take or requiring them to take. So it's been an interesting experiment this year as we have entered into this phase of offering the options. And I think so far it's been working pretty well for us. And then continued academic advising is another requirement that we encourage our students. Now, we don't have a way to track academic advising specifically for Oregon Promise students at this point. But with the advising redesign coming soon to PCC, we are expecting that we'll have better tools so that we can actually do some more tracking and make sure that we can actually plot, if a student is seeing their advisor regularly. So we make it a recommendation at this point, although again, I kind of highly stress those recommendations with students and with my communications and newsletters and all that stuff. I make sure to always reiterate that to them. If a student does not meet our successful academic progress standards the first term, which typically means that they are going into academic warning, typically an intervention is not required at PCC. We usually don't really require a student to meet with an advisor until they are in the second stage of academic probation. But what we've done in this past year is start notifying our advisors through the advising coordinators of students who are not meeting successful academic progress after their first term and go into warning. And the advisors are doing their best effort to reach out to these students because we would like those students, we're requiring of those students to come and meet with an advisor, hoping that an intervention early on will help. And actually, I have some data from last year that shows that a good number of students who were in academic warning after their first term at PCC and who were in contact with an advisor actually went back into good standing by spring term. So that's encouraging, and we will be, I will be providing this data to our academic advising coordinators at the beginning of winter term. And I continue to send information about these requirements, including academic advising via email to the students' MyPCC account through both videos and written newsletters. Okay, that was kind of an overview of the first year experience components here at PCC. I just want to give about 15 or 20 seconds for participants to ask any questions at this point, if you have any. So I'll be quiet. And if you want to type a question into the chat box, you can do this. Oh, will we get a copy of your slides via email? So Mallory, I will actually show you at the end of this, all of the information that's here. It's actually available through the PCC Oregon Promise site. And I will show you where you can get that information. If you actually want the slides, I'm happy to give you access to them as well, but you'll be able to actually get this straight from the PCC website. Yep, sure thing, Mallory. Any other questions? And again, if as I move forward, if you need to ask a question, just put it there in the chat box. And we'll keep going. So quick review of Oregon Promise. I'm sure some of you are very familiar with this information, especially our friends from HEC, but want to make sure that our staff here at PCC is also familiar with it. So Oregon Promise is a state grant for recent high school graduates and GED recipients that covers most tuition at any Oregon community college. I have another notice here from another participant. Do all students on academic warning have their academic advisor contacted? So we don't have, in every case, we don't have an academic advisor necessarily assigned to a student because we're not yet at a point where we have a specific caseload of students assigned to specific students. Hi, Annette. So what happens is I have the list of the information of the academic advising coordinators, and I send them the information to them, and then the advisors distribute that information for them. Mallory is saying, I thought Oregon Promise was about $800 a term. Is it more than that? I will show you why you think that is, Mallory, and we will go over the cost, the awards, because it depends on what other type of aid you're eligible for, okay? Oh, and my light just went off in here, so things got a little bit darker in my room. So Oregon Promise, like as the statement says here, covers most tuition at any Oregon community college. And there's reasons why it's most and not all, and I will explain that as we go through the presentation here. So the qualifications are that you need to be a recent Oregon high school graduate or GED recipient, have a 2.5 cumulative high school GPA or higher, or if you're a GED recipient, you need to have completed all GED tests with a passing score. You need to have no more than 90 college credits completed or attempted by the time that you start in the program. Be an Oregon resident at least 12 months prior to attending, and plan to attend an Oregon community college within 6 months of graduation, okay? And funding is subject to legislative approval, depending on what the folks at Salem are able to allocate every biennium to the program. Other requirements are that students must apply with either a FAFSA or an ORSA application in addition to the Oregon Promise application. This plays into the question Mallory had earlier, but we'll be touching upon that a little bit later. So if you are a citizen or a permanent resident, then you would file a FAFSA application. If you are a DACA or an undocumented resident, then you would file the ORSA application. Heather asked, is this regardless of financial need? So at this time, financial need is not a consideration for Oregon Promise eligibility. It has been in the past, and it could be again in the future, but at this time, it is not. So ORSA is the application that DACA and undocumented residents are able to apply to be considered for state aid only. And since Oregon Promise is a state program, that's covered there. Other important things, and this applies to other financial aid questions or financial aid awards that any student is eligible to receive, and that is the verification requirements. As you know, we have students who their awards can get delayed in being disbursed to them if any of the financial aid office's verification requirements are not satisfied. Things like IRS transcript or some additional documentation regarding their household size, etc. Sometimes it's something simple like a copy of the high school diploma. So those verification requirements, just as they need to be met for other types of aid, also need to be met for Oregon Promise in order for students to get their aid. Also, students need to accept all state and federal grant aid that they are eligible to receive. So if a student is eligible for need-based aid, such as the Pell Grant or the Oregon Opportunity Grant, they need to make sure that they have accepted that. And as we mentioned earlier, the first-year experience requirement, that's also something that they need to complete during their first year at PCC. Students must maintain half-time enrollment at 6 or more credits. They have to be at least half-time students. Annette Murphy asked, they don't have to accept direct loans though. No, they do not have to accept loans, but they do have to accept the grants for Oregon Promise to kick in. Loans are an optional thing that students can accept, if they want to. Minimum half-time enrollment of continuously through fall, winter, and spring, or depending on when the student starts, they just need to continue term by term, with the exception of summer term, because Oregon Promise does not pay out money in the summer, so students can take a break in the summer. And they need to meet the college's successful academic progress standards, satisfactory academic progress, which is 2.0 GPA here at PCC, as well as completion of 2/3 of all attempted credits every term. I should mention too that the halftime awards are prorated, right? So if a student is eligible, takes 6 credits, they fall into the halftime range, and so they get half the award than a full-time student would get. I will go over a breakdown of these things in a little bit. Any other questions on the information that I just covered about requirements before we jump in a little bit more of a deep dive into the Oregon Promise coverage? I am ignorant. How do they access the ORSA? I will show you towards the end of the presentation, Annette. So we'll get there so that you know where to get that information. Okay, I'll continue to move forward. I appreciate the questions, and we will look at, I will answer those as they come through. So understanding the coverage, we're gonna start to get here into the question that I think was Mallory who asked about how much money it was. So the cost of attendance in a community college in Oregon is impacted by multiple factors, okay? There are varying tuition costs throughout the state. So not 2 community colleges necessarily have the same tuition rate. Oregon Promise bases its awards on a full-time load of 12 credits. So in other words, if a student registers for more than 12 credits, they are not going to get more money. They're going to get up to whatever that 12 credit amount that has been set by the state is. And standard fees are not covered by Oregon Promise. So things like our student activity fee, lab fees, things of that sort, those aren't covered. And the awards range from anywhere from $850 to $3,537 per year. These are the amounts allocated for the 2018-2019 academic year. So to Mallory's question, yes, some students get as little as somewhere around $800, but that is because the way that Oregon Promise works, since it waits to see how much aid they're eligible to receive from other sources, from other grants, the Oregon Promise amount adjusts based on that. And the amounts will vary each year. It depends, if what type of money the legislature approves, as well as where the status of tuition is in the state of Oregon. If tuition is raised at the state level, or different community colleges have to raise tuition, in the past, OSAC has adjusted their rates accordingly. So the amounts are calculated by OSAC using an average, because again, all community colleges in the state of Oregon, we have 17 of them, and they all charge tuition a little bit different, okay? Some are a little bit more expensive, some are a little bit less expensive. And so for OSAC to figure out what would work best as far as determining award amounts, they decided to draw an average. And so they base their awards on the average cost of 12 credits per term at an Oregon community college, okay? An Oregon Promise will cover up to the average tuition charged by Oregon community colleges in the state. So if a college is above that average tuition, then a student has to cover the difference in that tuition cost. This goes back to that statement I showed earlier that Oregon Promise covers most tuition costs, because in some situations, students may have to cover part of their tuition. And in institutions where the cost is either below or right on the average, then Oregon Promise will pay up to whatever the tuition cost is in that college. So here are some illustrations that show how this works, okay? So if you look at the kind of intercut line here on the right side of the screen, that represents the average cost per year for a community college in 2018-2019. The college at the top, College A, that would be a college like PCC, where we are above the state average. So Oregon Promise would cover the section shaded in blue up until it reaches that state average amount. Anything above that, even though it's still tuition dollars, would have to be covered by the student. In the other two cases, College B and C, colleges that either fall right on the average or below the average, then Oregon Promise covers the full amount up to the tuition at that institution, for tuition only. Again, they don't cover the fees, okay? Oregon Promise pays tuition up to 12 credits after all need-based federal and state grants have been applied. So this goes back to Mallory's point earlier. You were wondering, isn't it only around $800? Well, it can be, because Oregon Promise is what's called a last dollar grant. It waits to see what other types of aid a student has already received. And so then the award that they receive from Oregon Promise varies depending on how much grant funds a student is eligible to receive through state and federal grants, typically need-based grants, okay? And that need-based aid is based on the EFC, the expected family contribution, which is what the state uses to determine the level of financial need. Just quickly, for those of you not familiar, you may have heard this term EFC. So as the term implies, it determines how much your family is expected to contribute to your education. And it's calculated from the information that students provide on either their FAFSA or their ORSA. So let me show you a couple of examples here that explain this. So the student at the top, student A, Mallory, this would be a student that probably gets something like $800 a term, okay? This student has a low expected family contribution. The student is not expected to have a lot of resources to help them pay for college, and therefore they have a high level of financial need. So if this entire bar represents their cost of tuition, the Pell Grant and the Oregon Opportunity Grant for this student are substantial. This is somebody who qualifies for the largest award in federal and state grants prior to Oregon Promise being applied. So in this case, the portion that Oregon Promise contributes is fairly small. It could be an award, say, around $850, because they already receive a large portion of their financial aid through these other sources. The student in the middle is somebody who would be eligible, say, for some federal or some state grants that are need-based, but not to the level of the student at the top. So in this case, let's say that the student gets a partial Pell and partial Oregon Opportunity Grant. In this case, then the student gets a larger portion of Oregon Promise funding because it's based on how much money the student already received from other grant sources. And then the student at the bottom, we had seen the question earlier, is it need-based? Well, at this point, it is not need-based. So in this point, there's a student here, for example, who their EFC is pretty high. The amount of money that the student has available to them, and perhaps based on the family's earnings, is determined that the student is not eligible for any Pell or Oregon Opportunity Grant funds. So in that case, Oregon Promise covers the entire tuition cost up to that 12 credit average that the state uses. Let me see, if student takes over 12 credits, can Oregon Promise go towards the additional amount if the Pell doesn't cover it? I think you just answered me. No, so yeah, so the student takes over 12 credits, they still get the same amount, no matter what, right? So in this case here, for example, the case in the student in the middle, this award, the total is gonna be based on that 12 credit amount, even though it's a combination of Oregon Promise and other funds, okay? And okay, yeah, you're welcome, Mallory. I'm glad that helps. It's gap funding, correct. It's called last dollar or gap funding. They wait to see what type of grants you're eligible to receive, and then whatever the gap that remains, that's where Oregon Promise kicks in up until that 12 credit average amount set by the state, okay? Oh, Amy is jumping in here, and so I'm gonna go ahead and read over this information here. Amy is saying that she wants to clarify one point, that although we don't have an EFC limit for the current year, our office evaluates this each year. So for the next year, 1920, they have not yet determined or announced if there will be an EFC limit, and that we will know this in the spring. Yeah, Amy, I actually mentioned something about it earlier, but I might not have been so clear that there has been an EFC need-based limit set in the past. There isn't one this year. That doesn't mean that there will be or there won't be one next year. So that's something to keep in mind, that OSAC has, depending on the level of funding that the program is receiving, they may choose to use an EFC need-based calculation in the future. But at this time, as far as the 18-19 academic year is concerned, there's no EFC limit applied. And if you look through all of the Oregon Promise literature on the OSAC website, they always have a statement saying, EFC may be something that is used to calculate awards. So that's just something to keep in mind. Up to 90 credits attempted. This is important because the language can sometimes get a little tricky, because what gets out there in the community is Oregon Promise pays for 90 credits. But that's not exactly the case. As the program currently stands, Oregon Promise pays up to 90 attempted credits, okay? So that means that if the student has taken credits prior to attending a community college, those credits already count towards that 90 credit total. Oregon Promise, again, kind of like the idea of covering the gap, right? Oregon Promise will pay for credits up to that 90 credits. That's considered equivalent to about a 2-year program. Oregon Promise is not restricted by time. The student doesn't have to be done in 2 years. They simply will receive the benefit up until they cross that 90 credit line. So here you have a student who had attempted 10 college credits while they were in high school, maybe as part of a dual credit program. So by the time they begin with Oregon Promise will now cover up to that 90 credit mark, which means they have another 80 credits that the program will cover. Also note that the operative word here is attempted, okay? Attempted credits, not successfully completed credits. If a student fails a class, the number of credits that course, the value of that class counts towards that 90 credit total, even though they didn't earn any credit for it, okay? So it's also imperative the students pass their classes, right, to make the most out of this benefit. Because classes that they don't pass are credits that they lose and they don't get to recover. Now, I added this slide that says up to 90 credits in quotation because a student technically gets cut off from their award after they cross the 90 credit mark, okay? But that final term, when they cross that 90 credit mark, they may actually end up with a little bit more than 90 credits. And Oregon Promise will still pay up to the full amount based on the award amount. So that's something to keep in mind because students can sometimes get confused and think, oh, I only have 3 more credits. I'm only 3 credits away from completing my 90 credit, my Oregon Promise requirement. But then you have to register for 6 credits. So then there's some confusion there about, well, how much will Oregon Promise pay for? And in the past, Oregon Promise had used multiple formulas to kind of figure out how to best break down those awards. But I think it got a little complicated to figure that out. So what they decided to do is that they will basically pay through the term when a student crosses that 90 credit mark, okay? So here are some examples that I created just to kind of help illustrate this. And these are very extreme examples, but it's just to kind of give you an idea. So student A on the left here, let's say that by the time winter term rolls around, this student has completed a total of 78 credits at PCC. So in spring term, they register for a full-time load of 12 credits. By the time spring term is done, they will have attempted 90 credits at PCC. And so from that point forward, Oregon Promise doesn't pay anymore, right? The student at the point when spring term credits are calculated and completed and the student receives their grades, this student will be done receiving Oregon Promise funding. The student on the right is in a similar situation. And again, this is kind of an extreme example, but let's say that the student reaches winter term and they are at 89 credits, okay? So students might think, oh, I only have 1 more credit that Oregon Promise will pay for. Well, no, in actuality, Oregon Promise will pay through the next term that when they cross that 90 credit limit. So they can take, say, another 12 credits in the spring, and by the time spring term is over, that student may have 101 credits, okay? But what happens is that the student then, because that was the term when they crossed that 90 credit limit, then they just happen to then get a few more extra credits there covered by Oregon Promise. So it's just something as an advisor, to be strategic and especially to be thinking, I personally get concerned that a student might register for, say, less than 6 credits because they're looking at their information. Let's say they're only 5 credits away from reaching the 90 credit mark. But if they only register for 5 credits, then they don't get the Oregon Promise. No, Oregon Promise lets them register up until the full award that they offer, as long as and then once the student crosses that finish line of 90 credits, then that becomes the last term that they've paid for, okay? So there's something to keep in mind when talking about the 90 credit limit with students. This is a table that I put together to help advisors and other professionals understand how your money how far your money goes depending on where you fall in the number of credits that you take. Because one of the things that happens with Oregon Promise and other awards too is that the way that they prorate credits is based on a range, okay? So a student is considered a half-time student, whether they are taking 6, 7, or 8 credits. And they are considered a 3/4 student, whether they are taking 9, 10, or 11 credits. Yeah, and Annette says just like the Pell, that's right. And so obviously, taking 6 credits is gonna cost less than taking 8 credits, right? It's gonna cost $666 for a 6 credit student versus $888 for an 8 credit student. But the award that Oregon Promise pays out is the same regardless of where you fall in that range. And so your out-of-pocket cost, that piece that goes back to the statement of most tuition, right, is gonna be different depending on where the student falls on that range. The half-time 8 credit student is gonna have an out-of-pocket tuition bill of around $323, whereas the 6 credit half-time student only has a tuition bill of $101 after their Oregon Promise is applied. By the way, this says OP award after copay. Oregon Promise takes a $50 copay out of the students' awards every term. And that's part of the legislator. It was legislated in the original law for Oregon Promise that students felt like they were making a contribution towards their education. And so that's why it says after copay here. The student never sees that money. It gets awarded to the student after that copay is taken out. But I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that in the table here. So the other interesting thing here is look at what happens on the thresholds, right? So you have a student who's taking 8 credits, and because they fall in that half-time category, their out-of-pocket cost is $323. A student taking 9 credits all of a sudden bumps into the next category, which is a 3/4 time category. So in that sense, now they are eligible for a slightly larger award, and their out-of-pocket cost then goes down. So the student who registers for 8 credits ends up with a higher out-of-pocket cost than the student taking 9 credits. So this is, again, an important way to strategize with students, right? So if a student tells you they want to be a half-time student, well, you might want to ask them, well, what does that mean for you, right? Because if they say they want to take 8 credits, you might want to ask them, well, is there a 1-credit class you also need to take? And adding it to your schedule might then bump you up, and you might get a little bit more money to help you cover and mitigate some of those out-of-pocket costs. Or if the student has to be half-time, then you might want to advise that student to stick closer to 7 or 6 credits so that their out-of-pocket costs get limited, right? Or are not as large. So, okay, so Mallory says, I did not realize it's like Pell, 100%, 75 or 50, depending on the amount of credits. But before, wasn't it like the opportunity grants, either 100 for 12 or 50 for anything under 12? Not to my knowledge, Mallory. As far as I know, since the beginning of the program, they've always had the 3 levels, the half, the 3/4, and the full time. And then Annette asks, I talk to parents and students about this all the time, but tell them to watch the cost of the textbook or fees for that 1-credit class. Yes, that is a very good point too, Annette. That, it could be that in the long run, balancing things off with that extra credit to try to get a little bit more money could cost them more if there are other costs associated with that class. So thanks for pointing that out. I should also point out, these examples here really apply to the student who was only Oregon Promise eligible, right? Or who's getting that full amount. But let's say that there's a student who has a scholarship, or let's say that they're one of the students who are eligible for the maximum Pell and maximum Oregon Opportunity Grant. In some of those cases, those students have enough tuition from the Pell and the Oregon Opportunity Grant that Oregon Promise doesn't have to pay any tuition. And Oregon Promise still pays out that $850 per term to that student. So then they actually have a little bit more wiggle room with additional funding to cover costs. Or students who receive a scholarship, either that they got through high school or that they got through the PCC Foundation, et cetera. That gives you a little bit more buffer room there to play with. So this is kind of, again, an example when we're just looking at Oregon Promise dollars only, or the Oregon Promise amounts only, okay? Okay, so any questions up until that point? I know that a few of them were shared just now. Any additional questions as we move away from the coverage and to talk about the application process? Did you answer Annette's question about academic advising? What to make sure I did not miss the answer? Mallory, what I said is that the a list of students in academic warning, I share it with the academic advising coordinators, and then I leave it up to the coordinators to distribute those lists to their advisors and their staff. They make the attempts to reach out to those students that work best for that particular office. I know that advisors are already pretty busy as it is, but just to kind of, as long as everybody's making, a good effort to try to reach those students. CTE advisors, Annette, I actually have a list of CTE advisors. And so if I am aware that the student is in a CT program, I will send the list of those students to the CTE advisors. The problem is that the major that they have listed in the system doesn't always match what they're planning on studying, and vice versa. I've had students who have a CTE major listed in their program, and then when I send the information to the CTE advisor, that CTE advisor will tell me, oh, that student is not in my program, actually. So it's a bit of a juggling act that we do. In some cases, we do a little bit of back and forth. The academic advisor coordinators will check through the list. Any CTE students that they find, they will refer them to me. I will refer those to the CTE advisors. And then it might be that the CTE advisors find out that they're actually not CTE students. So it kind of goes back and forth. Aviation science students all have the major and they almost all end up in warning after the first term. Is that something you are aware of? No, that was not something that I was aware of, but I'm happy to notify you if any information that I get of students in aviation science in academic warning to let you know, unless you don't find that it's necessary to get that information if those of you who advise those students are already on top of that. I'm not moving enough in this room to keep the lights on. Okay, any other questions? Did I address your question there okay, Annette? Okay, you think they're okay, all right. So I mean, worst comes to worst, the CTE advisor will get a list of Oregon Promise students in academic warning, and then you can use your best judgment to see if it's something that requires an intervention with the student or not. All right. So Annette, you had asked earlier, where do students apply for the ORSA? Well, they also apply for the ORSA as well as for Oregon Promise at oregonstudentaid.gov. I like to direct students to this page because they've done a really good job of kind of putting everything together in one location where all the applications are available. So I'm going to click on the link here now to take you there. So from the Oregon Promise page, which is the OSAC page, oregonstudentaid.gov, you will see from here that you can, you'll have lots of information and all of these different options here. But if you just click on apply here, you have access here to the application links for everything that relates to Oregon Promise, right? So Oregon Promise application, click right there. The FAFSA, you can click there. The ORSA, you can click there. And then OSAC scholarships are also managed by the OSAC office. So since they are also managed by Oregon Promise, students can also file their OSAC scholarship application as part of what they apply to through the Oregon Promise application. The application requires a creation of an account, similar to like creating a portal account. And then once you have access to your OSAC account, within the application, you are then able to choose which programs to apply for. So students can apply for Oregon Promise and the OSAC scholarship, okay? I'm gonna go back here again. The ORSA link is right there. So if you click apply, it first takes students to a pre-filter tool to make sure that the student is eligible to file an ORSA application. Otherwise, it'll tell them, no, you actually need to file a FAFSA. So they can go through the little set of questions here to determine if ORSA is the right application for them. And then it'll lead them into the ORSA application. And that, all that information's there. I wanna go back to the Oregon Student Aid page also, because from here, there is a really good page with a lot of information that the state puts together on Oregon Promise. So if you click on that link, you can get a lot of great information here. I'm not gonna go into a lot of detail because we're coming up into our last 15 minutes here. But know that there's some great FAQs with lots of information depending on the student population that you're talking about. You can find information there about all sorts of the typical questions that come up regarding Oregon Promise. Also, if you want materials to distribute to students, they have tools like here, like the current college student toolkit, and they also have a toolkit for incoming students that you can get flyers and webinars and all sorts of fun things there to distribute and share with students about Oregon Promise. Wanted to point out something really important, and that is the deadlines to apply. So among the points that they highlight in the main Oregon Promise page, they have this very handy table, which would be smart for, especially for those of you who advise students who might be running into students thinking about applying for Oregon Promise, that these deadlines are critical because Oregon Promise is a one-time application only, meaning you have a deadline to apply based on your high school or GED completion date. And if you miss that deadline, you miss your chance to apply ever. There's no chance to apply again in the future. I get students frequently who are like, oh, can I just apply next year? And unfortunately, we have to tell them no. If you miss that initial opportunity to apply, you miss out on applying for Oregon Promise. So notice here, for example, the majority of the students, those that graduate in the spring, will fall, for the high school students, will fall in this group here of March 1st to June 30th, also for the GED recipients. And the deadlines to apply for high school students, by June 1st, they needed to have filed their Oregon Promise application and either the FAFSA or the ORSA application. And they must then be enrolling, in order to meet that 6-month window requirement, they need to be enrolling by fall term. If you're a GED student, you have the same date ranges as far as determining graduation date, but you do have different deadlines for completing your applications. So for those spring students, it's July 5th, again for fall enrollment. Do notice that there is a group that overlaps for the students to notice that there's a July to November, but there's also an October to February. So there's a group that falls between October and November that actually can have a choice of which term they want to apply for, because they are within 6 months of potentially 2 terms. So that's information there that you should keep in mind. Okay, I don't really work with any high school students, but lots of GED students. What, for example, if someone finishes their GED December 6th? So that GED, that student would fall on the third group here. They would have finished between October 1st and February 29th. They will have to make sure that they file their application by March 5th, and they would be an incoming spring student. So if that student is thinking about being done around December 31st, you want to make sure that they've applied for FAFSA, ORSA, and Oregon Promise by March 5th, and they could potentially start receiving Oregon Promise funds starting spring term. Oh, and Amy is sharing a link there on the chat saying, we want to share another way to understand the deadlines is to use the Find Your Deadline tool. Yeah, thank you for showing that, Amy. That link is here as well. I'm gonna show it up on the screen. So a student can put in the deadline here when they think they're going to graduate. So they're like, okay, I'm gonna get a GED, and it's gonna be on December 21st of 2018. And then it tells me here, my deadline is March 5th to apply, and it will be for spring term, okay? So if the student is hoping to go winter term, they could, but they would have to pay for it through other means because they don't meet that winter term deadline based on their graduation date. I've had students, for example, in our ABE GED classes who may get like a tuition waiver for 1 term or tuition benefit for completing a GED class at PCC. So they could maybe use that tuition waiver for that term, for winter term, and then jump into Oregon Promise a term later, okay? All right, and then I wanted to go back, let me see, I wanted to make sure that I didn't miss out any additional information here. I think that was the main thing I wanted to show you here was the table. And this information, if you go to the communications toolkit, they have a flyer that also has that information available there. So I'll show you quickly what the fact sheet looks like here. And you see it has that same table there. And you can print these. I keep a stack of these myself. So if you see me and you want some of them, you can grab them. But this is a handy thing to print out and maybe have displayed on your cubicle or in your office to show those deadlines. And it's in English and Spanish. They have a Spanish version as well. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to my slideshow here and move on to the next screen, which is PCC specific Oregon Promise information, okay? So I maintain a web page through pcc.edu/Oregon Promise for people who wanna find out information specifically to Oregon Promise. And a lot of it is repetitive from what's in the OSAC site. I actually have links here to the Oregon Promise eligibility page and showing students where they can apply for Oregon Promise. But I do have a couple of other things that students can access here. Earlier on, I think Mallory had asked, yeah, where can I get a copy of the slides that I just covered here? So if you look here, I created what's called the Oregon Promise Startup Guide. So if you click on that link, the information in this startup guide is the same information that I've just covered here in these slides, okay? So you can look at information on the first year experience, review the requirements, understand your coverage, and have the contact and follow-up information there for me in the end. And so this is a tool that students can use as well as staff. So if you want to review any of the information that we've just covered, you just need to come to the pcc.edu/Oregon Promise page and get the information in the Oregon Promise Startup Guide. Here is also, okay, no. Can I still get your slides as well? Yes, I'm happy to provide you the slides as well. I'll make sure to share those with you. We also have, I mentioned earlier that one of the requirements for meeting the first year experience requirement is Panther Tracks for Oregon Promise. They can also access that from here. So when a student wants to do Panther Tracks for Oregon Promise, and I push this link out in a lot of my communications to students, they would just click there, and then it gives them a little bit of an introduction here. They click here to log in. Now, in my case, you don't get a login screen because I've already logged in and this system remembers your login. But in the case of a new student, it will have them log in with their MyPCC credentials, and then they can get started. And that way we can keep track of the student's progress to make sure that they've completed their Panther Tracks requirement. Of course, if they opt to do the CG100 class instead, we will track that also for purposes of FYE. So students, and I've actually have some students who have done both. They're like, well, they've done the online one because maybe they couldn't get into a CG100 class their first term. So they do the online to cover their bases, but then they're still opting to take the CG100 class later on. So that's a nice way to also cover your requirements. I mentioned earlier that I put together a newsletter, and that newsletter goes out to all current Oregon Promise students that I have on my mailing list. And it has, it's a video newsletter as well as a written newsletter. So the same information is on video and on the written email that goes out. And I have the folks over in our IT department. Yes, I sent one today, Annette. I just sent one a couple of hours ago. So if you want to check out where all those videos are, there's an Oregon Promise playlist through the PCC channel. So if you click there, it takes you to YouTube, and there's a list of all the videos that I've been putting together since I got started here at PCC. The latest one still isn't posted. I have sent it over to the folks at in our web team to post it to the YouTube channel, but that one is still not here. But you know, I cover all sorts of topics. I try to keep them relevant to different things that are important at a particular point of the year. So for example, the newsletter that I sent today was all about getting ready for winter term and things that you want to make sure that you're taking care of during your winter break, okay? So if you ever want to look at any of those older newsletters, sometimes I refer students to them if they have a question that I know I've already answered. I tell them, yeah, I actually talked about that in my newsletter from a month ago. So here it is again, so you can review it. And then lastly is about my availability. So if a student needs to meet with me, I have campus office hours that float throughout the PCC district. So my office is based out of the Southeast campus, but I actually spend 1 day a week at every PCC campus with the exception of Thursdays. Thursdays is my office day only. But on Mondays, I'm at Southeast, Tuesdays, I'm at Sylvania, Wednesdays at Cascade, and Fridays at Rock Creek for purposes of being available to students throughout the district. And so students can directly book an appointment with me right here. So if you're working with a student who wants to meet with me, they don't have to be playing phone tag or back and forth trying to figure out where I am to set an appointment. You can just refer them to this site and they can click there and book an appointment, and this will update in real time what my schedule looks like. So for example, here, Mondays at Southeast, this pulls up the next Monday and it shows you all the available times, and the student can then go ahead and sign up for a time that works for them to meet with me for my appointments at the Southeast Campus, and it sends them an email telling them where I am and where to meet me. So that way, it makes it easy for students who need to set up a time to meet with me, and whether it's an in-person appointment or maybe they just want to book me for an appointment for over the phone, I'm happy to meet with them in whatever way works. Student services throughout the district has been awesome, giving me space that I can use on a daily basis at each campus to set up shop, and that's how students can get access to me. So we are 3 minutes before the hour, and I'm sure people are ready to go home, but if there's any last minute questions here, I'm happy to address them. I will make sure those of you who are interested in the slides, I will make sure to make those available to you. These videos are all being recorded as well. So I will be making these available to staff for future reference, and also hopefully for folks who didn't get a chance to participate. But if there's any last minute questions, let me know. Otherwise, you are free to go and enjoy your Thursday night. Sure thing. You're very welcome. I'm glad you have a great break too, Annette. Thanks, Amy. I'm so happy that you jumped in, and I have to thank Amy in particular, because a lot of this information comes from the materials that OSAC has put together and the HEC have put together. So it's thanks to them that I have a lot of the information available here. Great, Mallory. I'm glad that you learned a lot. I appreciate you stopping by. Send the PowerPoint and video. Yep, I will do that. The video will take a little bit because the videos have to be captioned before we can distribute those, but I'll make sure to send you the PowerPoint up front. And we got 1 more minute here, so I will continue hanging here until the minute is up. Those of you who need to go do something else, feel free to do that. I'm just taking the note here to make sure that I get my PowerPoint. I think Annette and Mallory both wanted the PowerPoint as well. All right, well, thanks everybody for participating. I will be shutting off the session now, and have a great holiday break.